Well, good evening, and thank you very much for coming. It's really good to see anybody here tonight with the football going on. We must be a sort of select group of football-averse folk here tonight, so I'm really delighted that you've come along. We didn't know what to expect at all. I'm going to be giving the talk this evening. I'm Charles Wellington from the Friends. Just a few words of introduction. This talk is unashamedly a potboiler to hopefully help interest for our event that's coming this weekend. We've got Teesside Archives and Beamish Museum here to share their memorabilia of ICI, and a number of other owners will be bringing theirs too. We'll be showing some films by the ICI Billingham Film Unit, and there'll be a large number of still photos circulating through our TVs. We've really been knocked out by the support we've had from both the Archives and Beamish, and we're delighted that Julian Harrop from Beamish has come along very kindly tonight because he's been really helpful and he's going to put a good show on for us on Saturday. I'll also mention Jonathan Warren. I'm not sure whether he's here tonight, but he's from Durham University. He came to our last talk, and he's very kindly shared with me a book that he's recently published on his speciality called Industrial Teesside, Lives and Legacies. And it looks as though it's going to be absolutely fascinating, and we're going to see if we can lean on him and get him to come and give a talk based on that book, because it looks really good stuff. As to the talk tonight, as I said, it's a potboiler. It's made up of 3 smaller items on ICI, following on from the last talk. Like the last one, I'm afraid I'll be reading it. The largest of the 3 is the first, and it's about, as you see here, the founding fathers of ICI, back in 1926. It's in fact an article from the ICI magazine of December 1976, which marked the 50th anniversary of ICI's founding. 5 years previously, the board had commissioned historian W.J. Reeder to write a history of the founding companies from 1870, and then of the first 25 years of ICI to 1952. Reeder produced a 2-volume book. This is the second volume, which I think is quite wonderful. Its only drawback is that it ends in 1952 because of when he wrote it, which means the majority of the company's life is not covered. But I commend it as a source for the period it covers to everyone. I'm still trying to work through it. When ICI's 50 years came round in 1976, the board looked to Reeder to produce an article to mark it in a special edition of the ICI magazine. And he chose to write about the founding fathers, Harry McGowan and Alfred Mond. It's a marvellous article, and actually, as I say, I'm going to read it tonight. It takes about 15 minutes. It has some sort of, a bit too much about names of companies that they were involved in, but apart from that, I think it's absolutely riveting. I think, looking back, 1976 probably marked peak ICI. It was certainly peak Billingham. That was the period when we had the benefit of the gas contract, one of the very first industrial contracts for North Sea gas. At a very favourable price, the fertiliser business was making money hand over fist, over 120 million profit in its peak year. The ICI chairman then was Roland Wright, who had been chairman at Billingham, and 2 of his 3 deputy chairmen were also ex-Billingham chairmen, Ray Pennock and Stan Lyon. They were all very big men, and I think it was their successive reigns that led to the story getting about that all the key business decisions for Billingham were made on the touchline at the Centennial Rugby Club, because they were all keen supporters. When I go through the article, you'll see that Reeder gives ICI a pat on the back for safely clearing 50 years of very difficult times. But what I wonder is how the board would have judged their future prospects. Would they have suspected that in under 30 more years, the company would go from being peak ICI to ceasing to exist? The Reeder article has him pretending to be an informed source back in 1926, giving an inside account of the 2 founders and how and why they brought the company into existence. I was going on and telling the story of Roscoe Brunner separately, but in fact Reeder covers all the background to his fate. So I will run straight through from this bit about the founding fathers, just to do a bit about Roscoe Brunner. Literally, it'll take about 5 to 10 minutes on top of the first 15 of the Reader article. So if I may just get stuck straight in to the Reader article. And it starts like this. On Tuesday, 12th October 1926, Sir Alfred Maund and Sir Harry McGowan landed at Southampton from RMS Aquitania. Now, this is there. I'm afraid this is all you're going to have to look at while I go through this, because I've not got other photos of them. I think it's quite marvellous. Harry McGowan is on the left, with the rather fine spats at the bottom and a nice cigar in his hand, and Alfred Maund is on the right. And it was obviously something that was done, a picture that was done very specially for the founding, at the time of the founding of ICI. So they'd spent their time on the voyage from New York in working out plans for the largest merger up to that time contemplated in British business, the merger which produced ICI. And then he's just setting the scene, reader. Let us imagine that on Friday the 5th November, a guy he's called George Bullenbear, Esquire, of the London Stock Exchange, received a letter from an exceptionally well-informed friend discussing the two men chiefly responsible for the merger. Such a letter would give a detailed picture of how they were both seen at the time. So the letter starts, and this is it's obviously romance, but it's the way Reader has taken it. My dear George, you ask me whether I think Maund and McGowan are likely to get on well with each other, to make a success of this enormous new company they're forming. On the face of things, there doesn't seem to be much reason why they should. Maund is a wealthy, cultivated Jewish politician, an ex-minister of the Crown, and McGowan, the son of a Glasgow brass fitter, is the very model of a self-made Scotchman. Moreover, they both like their own way. Why should they get on? I gather they had never even met one another until July this year. They certainly don't know each other well, unless they've learned a lot about each other in the last couple of months. However, let us look at things rather more deeply. He starts with McGowan. It all started, they say, one day last January, when McGowan had lunch with Reginald McKenna. You remember, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer under Asquith during the war. Then when Asquith fell, he got out of politics and became chairman of the Midland Bank. McGowan loves his food and his drink and does a good deal of business over it. And McKenna wanted him to get Nobel Explosives, where he's managing director as well as chairman, to take over British Dyestuffs Corporation, where they are scared stiff of the new IG. Just that's from me. That's the German combination, which had happened a year before, where all their major chemical companies came together in a business called IG Farben Industry, which the Germans put together last autumn. McGowan grasped the point, having already decided in his own mind that 4 separate firms, all smallish in the British chemical industry, would be no match for the United Germans, or for the Americans either, though the American chemical industry is nothing like so advanced as the German. Moreover, he knew that the government is determined that we must never be caught again, as we were in 1914, without a strong dyestuffs industry, so that the survival of the British Dyestuffs Corporation was vital. McGowan saw the point, but he turned McKenna down. Nobel Industries had a great deal of cash, there's no doubt. McKenna, the banker, was well aware, and McGowan had not the slightest intention of letting it be used to prop up BDC, which, as you know, is a financial disaster, though I believe it is at last beginning to be quite strong technically. McGowan had an idea of his own, and a much larger one. He wanted to bring his own firm, Nobel Industries, together with Brunner Maund and the British Dyestuffs Corporation, perhaps also the United Alkali Company, though that was less important, together under one ownership. In other words, the plan for ICI was already clear in McGowan's mind at the beginning of this year, that's 1926, although at that stage he called it a British IG. This was a typical McGowan scheme. He spent all his life in the explosive industry, where since Alfred Nobel's day, they never had any time for anything so unscientific and wasteful as free competition. And he had built his reputation by arranging a succession of larger and larger mergers. Besides, he's very friendly with the DuPont family, and he greatly admires American ideas on large-scale corporate organisation, which up to now we haven't seen much of over here. Let me give you a sketch of the man and his career, and I think you will see how it all fits in. Do you, by the way, know McGowan by sight? He's about 52, quite tall, amply built, with a bald head and a florid complexion. The very picture of self-confidence and success, especially with a cigar in his hand. Not the sort of man you'd likely cross. In fact, I've heard that his directors are all afraid of him. But he has considerable charm of manner. If he asks a question and a junior doesn't know the answer, but is otherwise competent, McGowan will simply tell him to find out. But he hates any attempt to cover up. He's a bit of an actor, in the sense that among the men in the factories, he likes to talk in a broad Glasgow accent, which I believe goes down very well. He loves high living and he loves travel in the highest possible style. But his main idea of amusement seems to be telling outrageous stories. I don't think he has any interests outside the business, certainly nothing intellectual. He had a good schooling. No doubt his parents were ambitious for him in a thoroughly Scottish way. First at Hutchinson School, and then on a bursary at Allen Glen School, both in Glasgow. But he left school at 15, and I don't think he had any technical training. Instead, he went as an office boy to Novell's Explosives Company. I don't know how he got the job, but he was probably helped by the fact that in Novell's, unlike so many businesses, there were no owning families, so there were no sons, son-in-laws, brothers or cousins to get in his way, either at the start or higher up the ladder. I think he got his first important opening as assistant to Novell's general manager, Thomas Johnson, a powerful and ingenious, not over-scrupulous Scot, who had come into Novell's, chosen from over 300 applicants in 1886 when he was 36. Like McGowan, he had no technical background. He was a commercial man, a tough negotiator, with a firm grasp of all the elaborate network of market sharing and price-fixing agreements, which were a feature of those days, and with which they were already running the explosives industry, roughly on the principles that America belonged to DuPont, Europe to the German side of the Nobel Dynamite Trust, and the British Empire to Nobel's Explosives Company. The agreements were most meticulously kept. It must have been from Johnson that McGowan learned his trade, the trade of a professional negotiator, and he learnt it very thoroughly. In Canada, between 1909 and 1911, he carried through a complicated series of deals which led to the setting up of Canadian Explosives Limited, jointly owned by Nobel's and DuPont's, and thus to the division of the Canadian market between them. He took care to make himself liked by those he dealt with, and he gained the reputation of never driving too hard a bargain, preferring a willing seller to a resentful opponent. Johnson died in 1909, just under 60, and McGowan became assistant to his successor, F.J. Shand, a man of about Johnson's age but far less forceful. Death removed him, another of McGowan's seniors, in 1912, and after that there was really nobody between McGowan and the top of the business. Nobody, that is, except H.J. Mitchell, the secretary of the Nobel Dynamite Trust, the holding company of which Nobel's Explosives was a subsidiary. Mitchell, 2 or 3 years younger than McGowan, was, and still for all I know, may be a dangerous rival. He used to be on the new ICI board. For McGowan, the Great War was an unadulterated stroke of good luck, the sort of luck that every successful man needs, but not every man gets. The war shattered the Nobel Dynamite Trust, which was a joint European and German venture with the British, thereby at one stroke establishing the independence of Nobel's Explosives Company, McGowan's company, and demolishing the base of his rival Mitchell. At the same time, it enabled Nobel's to make very good profits, placing them well to take advantage of any opportunities of expansion that might arise. McGowan, by now dominant in Nobel's, and indeed in the British explosives industry, saw plenty. First being convinced that after the war the demand for all explosives, not only military ones, would fall away, he set himself to persuade all the explosive makers of any kind to come into a merger organised by the Nobel's, that is, by himself, which he called the Explosive Trades Limited, later Nobel Industries Limited. Then, strongly influenced by DuPont's example, he proceeded to invest a good deal of the new combined spare cash in firms connected with the motor industry, where he saw better prospects of growth than in explosives. It was a fairly logical choice because Nobel's had metal interests arising from ammunition manufacture at Birmingham, and explosives are chemically related to leather cloth for car seats and to cellulose paint for car bodies. He carried this policy to its zenith in the spring of 1920, when Nobel's, again following DuPont's lead, put £3.5 million into the common stock of General Motors. Finally, McGowan had a lot to do with setting up a British Dyestuffs Corporation, and for a time was on their board, though he doesn't seem to have given them much help. Explosives Trades Limited, renamed Nobel Industries in 1920, was set up in 1918, British Dyestuffs Corporation in 1919. By 1920, Sir Harry McGowan, KBE, as he had become, was a very great man indeed, not only in Great Britain, but in the United States as well, where, among other things, he had a seat on General Motors' board. Surely the next development was inevitable. Having in the explosives industry amalgamated everything in sight, what was left for him but to do the same thing for the British chemical industry as a whole, which badly needed concentration and rationalisation, if it were to hold its own alongside the large American and German businesses. Surely only a jolt was needed, from the end of the war onward, to throw the main British chemical firms into each other's arms. And surely the formation of the IG, the German combination, late in 1925, was a powerful jolt indeed. Certainly after talking to McKenna, the road must have looked clear to McGowan. The government were obviously expecting him to do something, and he knew what to do. In the chemical industry, there were 4 firms that mattered, and only 2 of them mattered much. Provided Nobel Industries and Brunner-Mond agreement, British Dyestuffs Corporation and United Alkali Company would have to do what they were told. McGowan, of course, would have to tell Sir Alfred Mond, chairman of Brunner-Mond, what he was planning and convince him of its rightness. He can't have been in much of a hurry, because soon after he had spoken to McKenna in January 1926, he went off to South Africa. He's very fond of South Africa, and he didn't meet Mond until early July. Then he discovered that Mond had a plan of his own for the chemical industry, a plan which discounted the idea of a purely British merger, and he relied instead on cooperation with the IG. I'll come back to that in more detail later. Mond's plan was a radically different plan from McGowan's, but then Alfred Mond is a radically different kind of man. His childhood and youth must have been wretched, for he was brought up in very wealthy surroundings as the fool of the family, outshone by his brilliant elder brother Robert, in terror of his father, the redoubtable Dr. Ludwig Mond, one eye and a ferocious temper, and intellectually pressurized by his blue-stocking mother, who died only about 3 years ago. He has always desperately wanted to be accepted as an Englishman, but when he was young, everything was against him. Family life was unrelentingly German, and at his public school, Cheltenham, he was not only a Jew, but a Jew who was no good at games. Imagine the misery of it. He still speaks English as if he were a German. I suppose it was in revolt against all this, that at Cambridge he spent so much time playing poker that he failed his natural sciences tripos. Add to this a rather unprepossessing, awkward physical presence, and a blunt, sometimes rather blustering habit of speech, occasionally amounting to rudeness, and you will see that Mond has had a good deal to overcome in politics. Yet for 6 years, as you know, he was in office under Lloyd George, and I believe that after a very uneasy start, and against a great deal of prejudice, he has made quite a good name for himself in the House of Commons, mainly because he speaks on subjects that he knows from first-hand experience and keeps to the point. I think he may owe a good deal of such political success as he has had to his wife, who has most of the social graces he lacks, and understands where his ambitions lie in politics. He was called to the bar in 1894 and practiced for a while on the North Wales and Cheshire circuit, but only with an eye to a seat in Parliament. For 12 years, from 1894 to 1906, he was a director of Brunner-Mond. He worked in their London office and looked after some of his father's other enterprises too. He cannot have been an easy man to work with. His letters, I have seen some of them, are often waspish in the extreme. When he went into Parliament as a Liberal in 1906, he gave all that up, probably with relief, and became a full-time politician, being rewarded with his title in 1910 and appointed to the Privy Council in 1913. In 1916, he went to the Office of Works, resigning from Brunner Mond's board. In 1922 came the crash. Lloyd George fell and Mond with him. Lloyd George, of course, will come back. He's only just past 60 now. But will Mond? Does he even want to? He's quarrelled with Lloyd George, and since the beginning of this year, he's gone over to the Conservatives. Has he decided to give up politics, like Reginald McKenna, and make the rest of his career elsewhere? Is he perhaps sick to death of the anti-Jewish prejudice, which has always pursued him in public life? Anyway, for whatever reason, Mond since 1922 has been back in business. He has a very good mind, with more than a touch of the German intellectualism as his family background, and he's full of ideas for the reconstruction of British industry, which heaven knows it needs after the slump 5 years ago and all the unemployment we've had since, to say nothing of the general strike and the miners' strike this year. He's a convinced rationaliser. That is, he wants to get rid of out-of-date plant and surplus capacity, and he believes in large amalgamations, not small units, not cooperating rather than competing with each other. In fact, he doesn't at all like free competition, in spite of his liberal past. For markets, he looks to the empire, which he's been heard to call the greatest economic unit the world has ever seen. I think you and I might agree with him, and a good many other people too. Perhaps one can begin to see how his ideas might run parallel with Harry McGowan's. You'll have noticed that when Mond turned again to business, he didn't at first pay much attention to Brunner Mond. That may have been because Roscoe Brunner was chairman, and I think there was a good deal of bitterness over the way old Ludwig had been got rid of years before the war. No doubt by that time he was very tiresome, but need they have been quite so brutal about it? Perhaps that's all gossip. But anyway, for whatever reason, Alfred Mond chose to concentrate on the South Wales coalfield, where he was MP for Swansea from 1910 to 1913, and was said to enliven political meetings by occasional Germanic shouts of "Vales for the Welsh." He became chairman of Amalgamated Anthracite Collieries Limited, and at the same time of Mond Nickel. In both these companies, he has been active in applying his theories of industrial organisation. Amalgamated Anthracite by now is well on the way to monopoly. Mond didn't entirely ignore Brunner Mond. In 1923, he went back on the board, apparently not with any intention of being very active. Soon, however, he found he had to be. You will recall, no doubt, that just over 2 years ago, in June 1924, I think it was, Lever Brothers launched an action against Brunner Mond for breach of contract over the supply of alkali, and the action was settled out of court, reputedly with enormous damages against Brunner Mond in November 1925. Since the action never came to trial, we don't know all the details, but it concerned the prices charged by Brunner Mond to Lever Brothers and to the co-op. I think Brunners had promised not to charge less to the co-op than to Levers, and were then found out to have done so. What is well known is that Levers and Brunners had been quarrelling with each other for years, and although it may seem incredible with a firm like Brunner Mond, there was a suggestion of fraud. But as I say, there was no court hearing. Perhaps they didn't like to admit a mistake to Levers and tried to cover it up, or something of the sort. One thing that is certain is that Alfred Mond was in no way involved, either in the long years of quarrelling or in the immediate cause of action, so that when the scandal came out, he was the man who had to clear up the mess. Things, no doubt, were kept decently quiet. And Roscoe Brunner, who must have been in some way implicated, resigned for reasons of health in the latter part of 1925. Alfred Mond became chairman of Brunner Mond. Wasn't it a strange, bitter way for a founder's son to come to the head of a family business? Mond became chairman just as the great IG amalgamation was going through in Germany. Like McGowan, he could see what a threat it presented to the British chemical industry. Like McGowan, he thought the best way to meet the threat was by amalgamation. Unlike McGowan, he did not propose a straightforward amalgamation of the British chemical firms. Mond, who has always had great confidence, I hope it's well founded, in his own technical judgment, based his plans on the need, as he saw it, for the British firms to gain access to German technology, particularly, I am told, to a process for hydrogenating coal to produce motor fuel and other oil products. If that could be done profitably and on a large scale, obviously it would be very important indeed for this country, especially since the experts assure us that the world's resources of petroleum will probably have run out by 1950 or so. Apart from its commercial attractiveness and its strategic importance, a really practical oil from coal process would help with the problem of unemployment in the mines. And for this reason, I think the proposition appealed to Mond, the politician, quite as much as to Mond, the businessman. Anyway, my information is that Mond was prepared, may still be prepared for all I know, to strike a bargain with the Germans, which would give our side knowledge of the oil from the coal process in exchange for allowing the Germans that access to the British market for dyestuffs, which they had before the war and are very anxious to have again. That wouldn't be very nice for British dyestuffs, but presumably Mond thinks oil is more important than dyestuffs, though whether he has convinced the government of that, I don't know. The deal that Mond proposed, I am told, though in detail very complicated, he worked it out in conference with the IG and with his Belgian associate Solvay, was in essence fairly simple. It was based on a three-cornered alliance between Brunner-Mond and Solvay, the IG and a large American combine, Allied Chemical and Dye. BDC would have been taken over by Brunner-Mond, very much enlarged to form a British IG, the same phrase as McGowan used, and so dyestuffs would have come under Mond's control. The scheme was very ambitious, worldwide in scope, and provided for a network of interlocking shareholdings, with IG no doubt taking a major interest. Mond's plan was totally incompatible with McGowan's idea of an all-British merger. I think it sprang obscurely, perhaps directly from Mond's German ancestry, for it seems to show a deep conviction that nothing could be made of the British chemical industry without German help. Some might have called it a sellout to Germany, but that I'm sure Mond would vehemently deny. McGowan, who must have been considerably alarmed by Mond's plan, quite failed to shake it when the two of them met for the first time in July 1926. Late in August, Mond sailed with a considerable entourage to New York, where he was to meet representatives of the IG and of Allied Chemical and get the matter settled in the way he wanted. Nobel Industries, it appears, was outside the charmed circle, though it's hard to believe that Mond had no plans to deal with them. He probably didn't like them very much, because in 1920 they had preferred to put money into General Motors rather than into a joint venture with Brunner-Mond to invest at Billingham in synthetic ammonia, which in any event severely strained Brunner-Mond's finances. Probably Mond thought that once his formidable alliance was lined up, Nobels would have to do what they were told. Mond's plan, I am told, was torpedoed by Orlando Weber, president of the American firm Allied Chemicals, who flatly refused to come in and instead denounced it as a market-sharing agreement preventing competition in the world alkali trade. This must have left Mond and the Germans nonplussed. Indeed, I'm told it did, but it left an opening for McGowan, into which he very smartly sprang. He had become so worried about what was going on in New York that as soon as Nobel's AGM was over that year, on 17 September, he took ship in the Mauritania. You can't get to New York any faster unless you could find somebody to fly you, and arrived, he couldn't have timed it better, to find Mond licking his wounds. From that moment, everything seems to have gone his way. Mond turned his back on his German friends and welcomed his new Scotchman. They travelled back in the Aquitania together, working out their plans for ICI on the way. Now, what do you think about it all? Mond and McGowan evidently intend to share the direction of ICI between themselves, so that a great deal will depend on whether they can work together. Yet they are men, as I said to start with, of totally different upbringing and background and of totally different personality. They hadn't even met each other until about 4 months ago, and when they did meet, they disagreed. They each had plans for reconstructing the British chemical industry, but they started from irreconcilably different standpoints, and Mond only accepted McGowan's plan because his own had been wrecked by weather. And now they propose to run between them much the largest business ever brought under one ownership in this country. How long can their partnership last? How long can ICI last? What do you think our grandchildren would make of it after 50 years, i.e. 1976, if it lasts 1/10 of that time? Yours ever, Arthur. And then there's a PS at the bottom which leads on to the next bit of the story. Have you seen this morning's papers about the tragic end of Roscoe Brunner and his wife? I wonder how Mond feels about that. Life plays strange tricks on him. So we'll actually go on from there, onto the little bit about Roscoe Brunner. But I just say two things, just to kind of, it doesn't complete the story, but Alfred Mond died in 1930, so this was taking place in 1926. He only lived for about another 4 to 5 years. Reader's conclusion in his book is, in large part, it was the failure, actually, of the Billingham investment, which he had been a great supporter of, that helped to contribute to his, he had other ailments and his demise. McGowan, on the other hand, went on, I think, to about 1950. He ran the company in an extremely high-handed way. And at one stage before the Second War, he had to deal with a considerable revolt from his directors because he had personally invested very substantially in General Motors as the company had invested. And as a result of the slump, the shares fell in value. And McGowan personally was as near as damaged to becoming bankrupt. And there were very big questions about whether his handling of his personal finances and his handling of ICI's finances were in conflict. And so the directors rebelled. They went through a long rebellion, and McGowan survived. And he, in fact, remained in control, and he kept his tight control right through to about 1950, when he finally retired. He also had another plan. He wanted to make his son his successor, and the board didn't like that very much. I think I mentioned at the talk I last gave that ever since McGowan's time, ICI has set its face against somebody who has all power, that is, being executive lead, managing director, and being chairman of the company. And that's the pattern that happened ever since that board I told you about in 1975 with Roland Wright. There was a chairman, but he shared authority with the board. And it was to do with McGowan's, the experience of McGowan. But goodness me, he lasted. But they weren't in conflict for a long time, simply because of the rather sad death of Alfred Mond. In reading Reader, you get a very strong sense that he didn't like McGowan much, but he quite admired Mond. But I can't really put my finger on it except to say you do get that sense. Now the last bit I wanted to just say, it's a postscript, which is the sad story of Roscoe Brunner. It's an interesting story, but in a way one feels one's pride in going into it, so I don't feel necessarily altogether comfortable with that. We've discovered the circumstances of Roscoe Brunner's resignation as chairman of Brunner Mond in 2025, a year before ICI was formed. He was the son of one of the two founders of Brunner Mond, Sir John Brunner, who had been Ludwig Mond's partner. We remember him in Billingham because of Roscoe and Brunner roads on either side of Mill Lane. Roscoe Road being some of the first housing built for the factory, and must have gone up while he was still chairman. I've always felt sympathy for him, in a world of such success, coming grievously unstuck and feeling the consequences so very badly. In his book, Reader is very discreet about his fate. I think partly because the Brunner family was still a significant presence. When I went to work at Billingham in 1975, I took over from one Tony Brunner, who was part of the family, and he moved on, so I never met him, but he was still around. Anyway, in his book, Reader simply says this: the collapse of Brunner Mond's defence against Lever Brothers destroyed Roscoe Brunner. He resigned the chairmanship. In autumn of 1926, when the names of the first ICI directors appeared, his name was not among them. his wife set about making a public issue of his omission from the list. He shot her and then shot himself. And that's all Reader says. But if you go into the internet, there's clearly quite a lot of newspaper coverage at the time, and I have picked out a little bit just to kind of flesh it out. One and the largest item was from the New York Times, and it runs as follows. English capitalist kills wife and self. Roscoe Brunner, former head of big chemical firm, was ignored in huge merger. His wife visited London newspaper Tuesday to complain of his being shelled. He had been in ill health. Murder and suicide in the London home of their daughter, Princess of Liechtenstein. And then it goes on. Roscoe Brunner, wealthy and former chairman of Brunner and Company Limited, and his wife, Mrs. Ethel Brunner, were found late last night shot dead in Green Cottage, Roehampton, the London home of their daughter, Princess of Liechtenstein. A revolver was clasped in Brunner's hand. From the position of the bodies, the police are satisfied that he shot his wife from behind and then turned the weapon on himself. Mrs. Brunner was wearing her hat, ready for an automobile journey with him. Brunner, some months ago, resigned the chairmanship of Brunner Mond & Co. because of ill health and was succeeded by Sir Alfred Mond. Shortly afterwards, the $200 million merger of chemical and drug industries, in which Brunner Mond & Co. was the chief constituent, was announced. Apparently, Brunner's health grew worse. Servants in the house said he had lately been incoherent and forgetful. The conductor of the omnibus in which he completed his journey to Roehampton last night noticed that he seemed worried and nervous. He had come in response to a summons from his wife, and a long conversation took place between them before the tragedy. A maid who knocked at the door was told by Mr. Brunner not to come in. Shortly afterwards, 2 shots were heard. Mrs. Brunner had apparently been kneeling down to look in the drawer of a writing table when she was shot. The bullet severed her pearl necklace. Her husband's body lay across her. According to statements published in newspapers here, it would appear that the shooting was preceded by a quarrel. It is stated that servants heard the voices of Brunner and his wife raised high, as if in anger. But what the quarrel was about is not known. One account says there had been continual bickering between them regarding Mrs. Brunner's alleged extravagance. Another paper declares that difference of temperament was accentuated by Brunner's resentment at his wife's interference in his business affairs. It's understood that Brunner was considerably harassed by large financial losses, although these did not mean he was a poor man. He persisted in keeping all details of his business to himself, and this action, it appears, upset his wife, who had a keen desire to know the inside nature of all his commercial transactions. I'm sorry, I failed you. One to say, refuse. Look, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. That's Roscoe Brunner. Again, I think a sympathetic looking guy. Mrs. Brunner was said to be much concerned because her husband's name was not on the list of directors of the new chemical and drug merger. This was disclosed by the Daily Herald. She sought an interview with the night editor of that paper late on Tuesday night, 24 hours before the tragedy, and called his attention to the omission of her husband's name from the directorate. And she went on to tell him how he had spent his life in building up the Brunner Mond Company business. She spoke without excitement, and there was no trace of hysteria or hint of the impending tragedy. It is stated she also visited the offices of a financial newspaper to seek advice concerning the position of her husband. A very sad story indeed, which I, as I say, always brought to mind. Whenever I walk most days I go down Roscoe Road or Brunner Road, I think of Roscoe Brunner. I feel rather sad for him, but a man who, when you compare him to a Harry McGowan, not really capable of competing at that sort of level, I think. Well, that's the end of those first 2. That's taken me, I'm sorry, 45 minutes. I've got another talk. We've got to change the presentation here, which I need Mark's help for, if we may. So there's got to be a pause. So if you want to just have a break, you're quite welcome. I'm quite happy to take a vote, which says you might want to clear off because there's still time to get back, watch the football if you want, or you may just be bored by what I'm saying. So I'm very happy if you prefer to call it a day, or we've got another, as I say, it's about 15 to 20 minutes, my last bit. Yes?
Where's that house, please, John?
I think it's it wasn't a name of a house that I knew. I believe it's around Northwich. I think that's the Bronner family interests were around Northwich, Winnington. That's where the business has grown up. Cheshire, yeah, Cheshire. That's where they came from. Well, if you want to have a cup of tea, it'll take us about 5 minutes just to sort out the last presentation. It could be the same. It's on a different subject. It's a quite different subject to this one, but as I say, it's not a long one. There are more slides on this one, and so I'm going to turn away. So do shout if it causes me to turn away from the mic. This talk came out of 3 discoveries. The first was finding a plan and some wonderful aerial shots of Haverton Hill. I'm going to use this thing. Until I saw this plan and these photos, I had no idea of the extent of Haverton Hill. And that it actually stretched. This is Bellicis. This is Bellicis going around the top of the ICI site. And that is Greenwood Road, where the rugby club is now. And the railway line is going over there. So you'll see that Haverton Hill stretched all the way from where the traffic lights are, all the way along Bellicis Avenue, right up to Greenwood Road. And right up, in effect, essentially to where the protein plant, now Corn, was. So it was very large, and I had really no idea that was the case until I came across that plan. Now, I'm afraid these don't come through wonderfully well, but on this photo, this is Greenwood Road. Here, this is Bellicis here, and you can see these are the houses in Haverton Hill. This was the most northwesterly part of Haverton Hill, around, let me get it right, Cleveland Avenue. And I know a little bit about that because Joe Pearson, are you here, Joe? Maybe he's back at the far end. Joe wasn't born there, but he spent his early years there, and it made a very big impression on him. So he was from Cleveland Avenue. That's where he knew. One of the interesting things that you see there, and it doesn't come out terribly clearly, is this will have been before the war. This was Bellicis Grange, the medieval Grange here, and you can see it, actually it's surrounded, I'm sorry, I've got a shaky hand, by all these corn stacks all the way around it, so it was functioning quite considerably there. And now, of course, that line is where the plate corridor runs to Wilton. It comes up this way and then it takes a turn here where the corn plant is. And then in the next slide, further away, and this is, I think, even more extraordinary. So that's the Billingham site clearly over there. This is Bellicis running this way. This is Greenwood Road. That's the area of housing we've just been looking at around Cleveland Avenue. That's, oh, I'm sorry, my hand shakes. It's awful. I must have DTs. That's Bellicis Grange there. These are the rows of streets up towards, along either side of Nelson Avenue, up towards Hill 60. And I think this is the area where the protein plant in Corn was developed. And then these houses were on either side of Collingwood Road and then abutted onto Bellicis Avenue. And that is the original offices of the UDC. I have seen a picture on somebody's phone. It was a very fine-looking building, but it's where they were established in 1923 after ICI then and Furness came into existence, and that's where they started life, because at that time, clearly ICI was a little bit behind Furness in building their own houses. So I've always been interested in Haverton Hill, and this fascinated me. Clearly, we can see it because the wind is blowing from the sea, from the northeast, whereas normally it blows from the southwest and it would be obscured by all that smoke and steam that you're seeing drifting away in the distance away to the southwest. It's coming the other way and blotting out Haverton Hill, and was the cause of why it became such a problem in terms of its atmosphere. And the other reason was
It's this area where the anhydrite mine is, where the boiler plants were, that were the generators of some of the greatest amount of grit and steam and fog and all the rest on the site. So it was, first of all, it was finding those photos. And then it was coming across the ICI, the film unit film, A Blackbird Sings Again in Haverton Hill. I remember being shown it when I first came to work for ICI in 1975, but I've never seen it since, and we happen to now have got a copy. It'll be on show over the weekend. It's well worth seeing. I've got some stills tonight for us to look at, because it relates to the story. But the film records the astonishing reduction in aerial pollution in the period 1969 to 72, produced by scrapping many of the old Billingham processes and plants and replacing them by new. As I say, do watch it. The film started with the massive pollution that Haverton Hill suffered. It had suffered it for 30 years. It was set up at the same time the Billingham site was developed in about 1919, and being down into the factory, as I said, closest to the most polluting plant. The film then puts up all the investment that was made. I think it comes to a total of £3 million by ICI in that period, 1969 to 72, and showed how those had largely eliminated the problem. Although by then, Haverton Hill was being demolished and its residents rehoused elsewhere. So almost simultaneously, with the problem disappearing, Haverton Hill also disappeared at the same time. I don't know quite how that timing came about. There's quite a lot of the Haverton Hill story. I would love to hear somebody else who knows more to come along and tell us about it. But the third discovery was an entry in the book, Life at the ICI. It's this thing. I'm sure a lot of you have come across it. Memories of working at ICI Billingham. It was by the Teesside Industrial Memories Project, and they went through not hundreds, but getting on for 100 staff over a period of time of all grades, talking to them of their experience of working at ICI across their experiences across every sort of aspect of life. I think it's a marvellous resource. It's a wonderful source because it actually fills that gap to some extent that Reader has left by his story ending in 1952. This, to some extent, allows it to continue. The entry, what caught my eye was an entry by someone called Alf Rout, who was a senior manager in Planning and Coordination Department, which was the key, when I worked for ICI, was the key central department, as its name indicates. They were the people who sat in the centre keeping everything together. And his service had spanned 1940 to 1977, so he'd been there a very long time. What he chose to remember in the book, and there are 3 or 4 entries from him, was always a little different from everyone else. And this entry was no exception. And I'm just going to read it. And it's very interesting. And it's headed, Unprofitable Plants and Processes. And this is what Alf Rout, talking to the interviewer, had to say. ICI Billingham was being insufficiently profitable in many ways. It wasn't giving ICI its expected return on capital, and it was quite clear that an important element in this was that the ICI site was highly labour intensive. If you look at the horde of miners underground and the large numbers of people working on things like ammonium sulfate and so forth, these were highly labour intensive, and you could get out of this by changing the style of processes at Billingham altogether. One way of doing it was to get rid of the anhydrite basis altogether. And before I went there, they had looked at this problem in pieces. Should we turn the old sulfuric acid plant into a sulfur burning plant so that you don't have all this cement business hanging around you? You could get rid of the anhydrite from the sulfuric acid plant in a fairly straightforward fashion, and this would take you out of the cement business to a large extent. But not entirely, because it was based partly on cement coming from the sulfuric acid plant and partly on chalk from the nitro chalk plant. The sulfate plant, and he means the nitro chalk plant, was the next big thing that one would like to get out of altogether. Ammonium sulfate was the main nitrogen fertilizer used by not only the British farmer, but many farmers around the world. But the sulfate part was no good at all to the soil. The sulfate was merely something there to hang on to the ammonia, which is a volatile gas. There's other kinds of chemical, ammonium nitrate, which has got nitrogen in both halves of its formula. Ammonium sulfate has got what? 20-odd% of nitrogen in it. Ammonium nitrate has got 35% in it. And you've got more than 1.5 times as much nitrogen in carriage, packing, and all the rest of it. But there were difficulties about changing over to ammonium nitrate, and there were many people reluctant to do it on that basis alone. But on the other hand, it would have been a step into what was then the modern era. So what I was doing was promoting a scheme for shutting down all the anhydrite-based activities, all together, all at once. And you could make quite a good case for that. I was well aware that I was dealing in a matter that would put a lot of people out of work. On the other hand, you could say I was dealing with a project that would keep a lot more people in work than would have been the case if the company had simply shut down their fertilizer activities altogether. So in a sense, I was doing a lot of people a lot of harm, but I was also protecting a lot of people from something a lot worse. It's an interesting and very frank take on things, and it's quite surprising to find it in that book, because most of the other accounts in that book are...
Just give the pad a little shake. Just put your finger on the mouse pad. It should waken it up again.
Something's come up there.
Okay.
Thank goodness for Mark. Thank goodness for Mark. Thank you, Mark. That's very good. All the changes that Alf referred to all happened. The mine did close. The factory changed over to ammonium nitrate with the new nitram plant to produce it. Also to sulfur burning, using imported sulfur rather than anhydrite. And to the new low-pressure ammonia plants based on natural gas feedstock. The boilers also changed over from coal to natural gas. Overall, it was a massive change, a really big investment in the future. Getting rid of the old solid raw materials, coal and anhydrite, got rid of all the dust, grit and fume they generated. But interestingly, the film focuses entirely on the benefit to the environment and to the environs of Haverton Hill, although, as I say, by then its population had moved on. Alf, on the other hand, didn't mention the environmental benefits at all and focused entirely on the business advantages of the change by reducing labour costs and the consequent problem of job losses. So there are two accounts, the film looking at it entirely from an environmental point of view and Alf Wright looking at it from a business point of view, which is quite fascinating, and that's what made me just flag it. The film actually tracks the changes on a before and after basis, and Mark has kind of lifted some stills from it to run through as a finale. They start, let me get it right, with slide 4. Oops, sorry. I don't seem to be able to change it. Sorry. You started changing. Yeah, you started. Will it go now?
Might do.
Oh, yes, let's go back. Because you'll have seen, that was the bird. The bird that started singing. And that's what I always remembered and stayed with me. That was the way they promoted it. I was shown it by a guy called Archie Doherty, who was head of the environmental side at Billingham, and had clearly been involved in putting through a lot of these changes. And I remember that bird, gosh, over 40 years. And this is a shot of Haverton Hill housing, and it dwells quite a lot on how bad the conditions were in Haverton Hill, and you see it in the film. And then that's a shot, it talked about the Billingham fog, and notorious, and it had these shots of, I think this is probably the old Fleetbridge Road that people are driving on with vehicles coming out of the blue. And then it goes through all the before. So this was the boiler plant, then fueled on coal. I think they said 3 million tonnes a year of coal that went through the ICI site, quite enormous. I talked about jobs in ICI, but what an enormous impact on the coal fields as well. of that changeover to natural gas. This was the cement plant, another generated enormous quantities of dust down on the Casebourne site beyond Harrington Hill Road. That was the anhydrite mine, just before closure. That was the nitro chalk plant, the ammonium sulfate fertilizer plant in the process of demolition, but again, an enormous generator of fuel. And those were 2 sulfuric acid kilns. I'm not quite sure how the process worked, but they burnt material, I suppose they burnt anhydrite and created immense quantities of dust and fume and acid actually. And that was another thing, that was the one thing I did remember, was the brown fume from the nitric acid plants. And so it goes from that to then what happened afterwards. And this is now the boilers fueled on natural gas. These are the LP ammonia plants, with just a flare out of the top. None of the consequential problems you had where you were making ammonia out of with coal and coke and the like. That was a nitrate plant which brought in ammonium nitrate. There is a shot I haven't included at the top. It had suppressing equipment at the top. I mean, it could be quite fumy in my time, I can remember, but it infinitely better than anything that had gone before. And that was the new sulfur burning plant that replaced those sulfuric acid kilns. It brought in sulfur from, I think it was from France. They brought it in France. This yellow stuff, and that's where it was made. And that's a shot. That's looking from Norton down to Billingham Bottoms and up again, looking at the factory with no yellow fume. No yellow fume there any longer. So it just really recorded a truly extraordinary change. You will all remember it. You'll remember the before and the after. But I came in 75, so it had happened by the time I came. And I was astonished. I was astonished by the quality of the atmosphere. The thing I remember seeing, and I'm a southerner, was if you drove up the A19 north, you saw Merton and Seaham and the various colliery villages, and they were all still burning their coal then. And that's what one noticed in the air, rather than anything over the factory. And clearly, with everything that they've done and that massive investment, I think at that stage, all that really remained on the environmental side was the quality of the river and the quality of Billingham Beck, which hadn't been dealt with at that time and was later dealt with. So that was just a little short item, really, because I was so fascinated to see these 3 things, those shots of Harrington Hill, which at last made sense of what it was like to me. And then on the one hand, the film, which looks at that enormous change, 69 to 72, and looks at it entirely from the environmental benefit which it created, which was massive. And then Alf Rowley looks at it from an entirely different angle, which is it enabled them to slim the company down very, very substantially. And it was that gas contract that they got at that same time that did the company. When I was here, that was absolutely the core of the business, was that marvellous deal they did with British Gas, getting in one of the very first contracts that then fueled the business. So that's it. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry we had some trouble with the Very happy to take any comments or questions or anything of that sort. I hope you found it interesting.
Not really a question, but a comment. I was a school child in the late 60s, and we had a bus trip to see them starting to demolish Harrington Hill because of the buildings were rotting with the fuels.
Yeah.
And they said that the people hanging the washing out, it was a waste of time because they just disintegrated on the lines.
If you go onto our Facebook, we've now got a YouTube channel. Is that right? That you can get to through our Facebook page. And Mark started to put on there some interviews, and we interviewed Joe Pearson, who saw he was in Cleveland Street. He lived his childhood in Cleveland Street. Loved it. Loved Harrington Hill. but his mother, he said, didn't like it in terms of cleaning and these sort of problems he had. But he loved it. And so we went through an interview and he talks about his experience there, what he felt about it and how he knew it as a community. And it had 3 or 4 churches and schools. It was really obviously vibrant. But when I came to work in 75, I worked in what's called Secretary's Department because I was on the legal side. And that also included the States Department. And my impression at that stage was that as part of whatever was done about the demolition, ICI had purchased, in effect, all those houses and all that land. And if you think about it, that must be the case because they were able to build a protein plant beyond Hill 60 there. So that I think the deal was that whether it was from British shipbuilders, I suppose at that stage, if they had succeeded for an S, that ICI bought it. Whether they had to pay for the demolition and the rehousing, I don't know. I don't know how that would have been funded or whether it fell onto the Urban District Council at that time who had to refinance. But just at that time, the Estates Department was just dealing with moving the last people, I think, out of. So this, as I say, 75, the last people clearing the last houses there. And funny enough, although I don't know whether they thought that, it was very interesting when you look forward then to, they were just investing, they were just opening the protein plant when I left in about 1985. And the fact that they got that land was really most important because, of course, protein was set up to provide animal feed grown on methanol as a substrate. And there was an extreme nervousness about locating it within the factory because you like your plants to be seen by farmers and customers for your product, and they just didn't feel that it was going to be comfortable at all in taking people onto the industrial site going to see where your animal feed was made. So there was a deliberate decision to locate it where it is, out into those green fields that have been cleared, of course, of Haverton Hill, so that it provided a better environment for the product. And I always rather thought that probably Fujifilm made possibly the same sort of decision for pharmaceuticals, that they perhaps wanted to have their big investment was not immediately within the factory perimeter, it was a step outside. Sorry, I'm glad.
A lot of these videos, this video and a lot of the others, you can access them online through the Yorkshire Film Archive.
Yeah, they're fantastic, aren't they? They're absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. There's one I can recommend to you, if you can't have it, which is, it's quite a short one, but it's about how in 1946 they dealt with paying the workforce. Something like 13,000 people who were paid a weekly wage, and how the organisation, the number of people that they needed to be able to take the cards that people had clocked on Monday of the day, take it away, calculate all the wages, get it all absolutely spot on, get the cash in, and then have it on Thursday. You did it. Well, it's fantastic. There's photos of you, well, film of you all. It's an enormous operation. Enormous. It looks so much nicer than a computer doing it. You sort of have confidence with people. Yes, it's like in the film they talk about it. Just about it. But it's well worth watching. It was a complete eye-opener to me. Well, all these films are actually interesting pieces. Kendra, you asked me to. You asked me to say something. Oh, sorry. The YouTube channel. We have a YouTube channel. So some of these talks are filmed and go on it. And we want to do more interviews. I mean, in a way, we're reinventing the wheel because the interviews in that book are magnificent. They're really good, really good. But we started it with Joe Pearson and it went quite well. And Mark does a magnificent editing job. Makes us look like film stars. So we quite enjoy it. If you would like to be interviewed, just volunteer. We'd love to interview. We're not very expert yet. Anyway, thank you very much for coming along. That's very kind of you. Good to see you all.